We're going to talk about plant functions in this video. It's chapter 9. Okay, so one of the last videos I'll be making for you. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, tropisms. Remember, this is the way that a plant basically reacts to stimulus. And a plant can react to stimulus in a couple ways. They can either grow towards the stimulus or grow away. Now, a quick refresher, what is a stimulus? Stimulus is anything that elicits a response. So, for a plant, that could be light, for example. All right, so a couple things. A stimulus is anything that causes a response for a plant. You have positive tropism or negative tropism. Now, you have to remember this difference because positive tropism is growth towards stimulus, and I would put / or growth with the stimulus. So growth towards or with the stimulus. And then negative tropism is growth away from or against the stimulus. So this is a couple different. So you can have positive or negative tropism. And you have a few different types. So the first type of tropism is in response to light. And this tropism is called phototropism. Photo stands for light. Tropism stands for reaction. So this is reaction to light. And it can happen two ways. You can have positive phototropism, which is growth in the direction of light. So wherever the light is coming from, positive tropism, the plant will grow in that direction. And then negative phototropism is growth away from light. And different parts of the plant will respond differently to each stimulus. So, for example, in response to light, the stem and leaf of branches of the plant, those are going to exhibit positive phototropism. So they're going to grow towards light. And this is really important. Now, in your mind, you should already know why it's really important for plants to grow towards light. This is because light is basically their food source. They're going to use that light energy to make glucose. So it's really important that the plant can grow towards light so it can get as much light as possible and undergo photosynthesis. Now, there is a part of the plant that exhibits negative phototropism, and that's actually the roots, which makes a lot of sense because the roots don't want to be above ground where there's light. They want to be where it's dark, underneath ground. So if a root ever breaks out of the soil, they're going to start reacting and grow downwards and make sure they go back into the soil. So roots are going to exhibit negative phototropism away from light, and the stems are going to exhibit positive phototropism towards light. Then you have gravity. Now, gravitropism is the fact that plants react to gravity, and this is a really important tropism because this makes sure that the plants grow in the proper orientation, meaning that the top of the plant grows up and the roots grow down. So how do plants know how to do that? It's because of gravity. So the stem is going to show positive gravitropism, the stem is going to show negative tropism. This means it's growing against gravity. So gravity pushes down and the stem grows against that. So it's going to show negative gravitropism. And that makes sure that the leaves and the stem always grow up. And then you have what we call positive gravitropism, and that is exhibited by the roots. And this shows that ensures that the root structures grow down into the soil. So whenever the seed is inside the soil and it germinates, how does it know which direction to grow? A big part of that is going to be gravitropism, right? The shoot, which is the stem, will always, even if it's upside down, it'll always shoot and grow up out of the soil and into the sky, making it grow nice and tall. And the roots, even if it's on top, it'll grow and then bend down. Then you have touch. This is another stimulus that a plant can grow in response to, and this is called thigmotropism. And this is in reaction to touch. So plants can react to touch and grow around it. We see this a lot in viney trees and vine plants like tomato plants that attach themselves to fences and other plants that help them give them structure. All right, then you have hormones. Now, we don't typically think about it, but plants have hormones as well, and these hormones cause a specific reaction. So a hormone is a small chemical made by some plant tissues that affect how other plant structures grow. We have 4 different types of hormones that we discussed, the first of which is going to be auxin. Now, auxins and cytokinins, both of these are going to cause plant growth. They're just going to cause plant growth a little bit differently. So auxins are going to cause cell elongation. So it's going to make the cell get longer. So if a cell's like this long, it's going to get longer after auxins move inside of that cell. So it helps with the plant growing taller. Then cytokinins, you guys should remember cytokinesis, and this is the splitting of the cell. So this is going to help the plant grow by creating new cells. So as a plant grows, you can't just let that plant grow super, super long, because then it won't be able to support. So if it splits into two, that's caused by cytokinins. This is another type of cellular growth. And typically, this is going to be lateral growth. So sideways growth is going to cause by cytokinins, and vertical growth up and down is going to be caused by auxins. Then you have abscisic acid. So abscisic acid is typically referred to as an inhibitor or as scissors. Wherever abscisic acid is located, the other hormones are not going to work very well. So if you have abscisic acid located in, let's say, the stem, and auxins want to go in there, they won't be able to. So it helps limit growth in certain areas. This is really important because it makes sure that the plant is growing at the rate it should, not growing too fast, not growing too slow. And it also has a really big impact on germination. So you don't want a seed that landed, let's say, in the fall. Now it's like waiting underneath the soil. You don't want to have that seed start germinating during the winter, because it's going to die. So the abscisic acid is going to make sure that the plant's going to germinate at the right time and the growth is happening how it's supposed to. So it's called an inhibitor. It inhibits all other hormones. And lastly, you have ethylene hormone, and this is a really interesting one because this one's actually in the form of gas. So this is going to be released by the fruit, and it actually is going to help in ripening. So making sure that all the fruits ripen around the similar time on a fruit tree. So ethylene is a gas, and it's released by the fruit, and it's going to have to deal with fruit ripening. So those are the 4 types of hormones that you need to know. Okay. Then you have short day plant, long day plant, and day neutral plant. Now these terms are always slightly misleading because they have the word day in it. But first of all, let's first define what's going on here. So a short day plant, what we're looking at is the flowering of the plant. So when is the plant going to flower? So a short day plant is actually not going to flower when days are short. That's a common misconception because of the name. A short day plant is actually going to be affected by the night. So always remember, it's not really the length of the day, it's actually how long the night is. So in a short day plant, they need a long night to actually be able to flower. So short day, they need a long night. In a long day plant, it's the opposite. So they actually need a short night to allow the flower to bloom. And then a day neutral plant doesn't really care. It can really flower regardless of the length of the night. Now that's really all you need to know for this class, all these differences for these terms. There are reasons why these is because of a chemical that's produced during the nighttime called phytochromes, but you don't need to know what those are. But that's why, if you were wondering. Okay, that's 9A. All right. Plant reproduction. Now here's where it gets a little bit interesting because this concept can be a little bit difficult. So the first type of reproduction we're going to discuss is going to be the reproduction in non-vascular plants. So the first thing that's really important is that a non-vascular plant relies on water for reproduction. They do not produce flowers, and these plants and non-vascular plants are called bryophytes. Bryophytes tend to grow in very moist environments near rivers or where there's a lot of rain. So when the water washes over, it allows for the movement of the sperm. So the water, like a wave from a rock or from rain, rushes over, and it basically carries the sperm into the egg, and that allows for fertilization. When that fertilization occurs inside a gametophyte, it's going to produce the sporophyte stage. So fertilization occurs, and it produces the sporophyte stage, which up here is the capsule. That capsule is the sporophyte stage. Remember, sporophyte produces, you got it, produces the spores. Once those spores are produced, eventually that capsule is going to open up, release those spores. Those spores will land down in the soil, and the spores will grow into the gametophyte stage. and that process continues. So you got the gametophyte stage, water rushes over the gametophyte stage, the sperm is carried into the egg, fertilization occurs, creating the sporophyte, which is called the capsule. The capsule pops open, releasing the spores into the rock or soil or tree or wherever this is growing, and eventually turns back into the gametophyte. So that's the cycle, the reproductive cycle of a non-vascular plant. Okay. Then you have, the alternation of generation. This is a really important concept that we see in all plants, is that the plants cycle back and forth between gametophyte stage and sporophyte stage. That's really all you need to understand for that. Then in a seedless vascular plant still do not produce flowers, so they're also going to rely on water as well. Okay? But the difference between a seedless vascular plant and a bryophyte is that instead, a bryophyte spends a majority of its life in the gametophyte stage. The seedless vasculophyte, or a fern, is actually going to spend a majority of this time in the sporophyte stage. Now, how do you know what stage the plant is in? It all depends on what is being produced by the plant. So if you look on the underside of the fern, which you guys have seen because I showed you in class when I brought you that fern, and it has those little brown dots that are underneath the leaf. Those are called sori or sorus. Hey, those little brown dots are underneath the leaf of the fern. And those sori hold the spores. So if you look at the fern and it has those little brown dots underneath, you know that those hold the spores. So because of that, it's in its sporophyte stage. So that's how we're going to start the reproductive stage for a seedless vascular plant. We're going to start the sporophyte stage because that's where it spends a majority of its lifespan. So you have the leaf of the tree called the frond. The leaf of the plant called the frond. Underneath that frond, you have the sori. Those sori eventually reach maturity and release their spores out into the environment, and they're carried down into the soil. As soon as the spores hit the soil, they create this heart-shaped structure right here. That heart-shaped leaf is the gametophyte stage of the fern, and there's where it's going to produce the gamete, the sperm and the egg of the plant. And they're going to rely on water. Now, the difference between this, they're going to rely mainly on rainwater because ferns can really grow anywhere. So when rain falls, that allows for water to go on this leaf, and it allows for the sperm to swim over to where the eggs are, and fertilization occurs. Once fertilization occurs, you see this little leaf starting to grow. It will produce the sporophyte stage, which is the frond. But before it produces frond, it's called the fiddlehead. This is the wound up one that eventually winds out into that nice, beautiful, long frond. The interesting thing about the gametophyte stage of the fern is that it is very short-lived. So it doesn't stay very long. Like I said, this fern spends a big majority of its lifetime in the sporophyte stage, very little time in the gametophyte stage. And all my life, I have never seen, and I take my classes out to look for these all the time, I have never seen the gametophyte stage of a fern. They're very, very short-lived. Okay. Then you have the reproduction of the gymnosperm. Now, gymnosperms are plants that rely on cones, so they do not produce flowers. And because of that, they cannot attract insects. Right? So they cannot attract insects for pollination. So what they do is that they actually have two different types of cone. They have a male cone and a female cone. The male cone is responsible for producing the pollen, and the female cone produces the seed. Okay, so what they'll do is instead of having, they'll rely on quantity over quality, they'll actually release huge amounts of pollen into the environment. And this is why we have our seasonal allergies, because gymnosperms release so much pollen. So what do gymnosperms rely on? Since they can't rely on water, they don't rely on insects, or they can't rely on insects, and they don't rely on water, they actually rely on wind. So the wind comes in, blows the pollen off the off the pollen cone, okay, and it releases huge amounts of pollen. And they hope, since they release so much, eventually some of that pollen reaches another cone, that's the seed cone, and allows for fertilization. So that's how gymnosperms reproduce. Then we get to talk about how angiosperms reproduce, and this is the most common form that we think of when we talk about plant reproduction, and this is because it actually deals with insect pollination. So angiosperms produce flowers. These flowers have very beautiful colors and smells, and even food like nectar that attracts insects to them. And when an insect lands on the flower, it gets that pollen on it, and when it flies to another flower, it deposits that pollen, which allows for pollination. Once that happens, that flower will eventually become the fruit and produce the seeds that are inside of that fruit. The fruit will be eaten or fall and roll away and produce another plant. So this is the most the way that we're most familiar with plant reproduction. And I'll go through that one more time. You have a flower. That flower attracts an insect. Insect lands on that flower, carries that pollen from one flower to another, and that's how pollination and fertilization occurs in angiosperms. So these are some structures in the flower. So you have the male portion of the flower. It's called the stamen. And the stamen is actually made up of a couple parts. So the stamen here in this part is these little yellow circles with the white filament right underneath. Okay, it's made up of two parts, the anther and the filament. The anther is where the pollen is located, and the filament is what supports that anther up. So it keeps it nice and tall, so when the insect lands, they'll get some pollen. And that's it. The stamen only really made up of two parts, anther and filament. Okay. Then you have the carpel. The carpel is the female portion, and it's made up of a few different parts. You have the stigma. That's the tip of the carpel, which is nice and sticky. So that's how it holds on to the pollen. Then you have a couple other portions. You have the style. This is the basically the tube that runs from the stigma down into the ovary. And the ovary is this bottom enlarged section of the carpel. And inside of that, you have the ovules. So we kind of got to teach those simultaneously. The ovules, these little tiny circles inside of the ovary, those are what's going to become the seeds. And the ovary, this outer layer, that's actually what's going to become the fruit. Right? So there you go. Then you have the petals. The petals are the parts of the flower that have the pretty colors. And their job is twofold. One is to attract insects, and two is to catch sun to warm up the nectar. And then lastly, you have the sepals. Those are these green leaves that are underneath the flower, and their job is actually going to be before the flower blooms. They surround the flower and protect the flower. And once it blooms, they really don't have a function. They say it helps support the flower and things like that, but their main role is going to be in protecting the flower before it blooms. Like it says there, when a pollen grain lands on I'll move it on another flower stigma, the pollen produces a pollen tube. Now, what does that mean? So I'll refresh your mind on that real quick. So as of right now, there is no opening between the stigma down into the ovary. When a pollen lands on the stigma, it basically develops a root-like structure that grows down through the style and eventually into the ovary and causes fertilization. Okay, like it says there, some fruits are spread by the wind, others are spread by animals. Fruits can be spread in several different ways, and I always like to remind you that when we talk about fruit, that doesn't necessarily mean like the fruits that we eat, like an apple or orange or stuff like that. It's not always something that we are common in eating. So, for example, sea grapes, those plants that grow near the ocean that has those grapes, we don't eat those, but that would still be a fruit. So fruit is any fleshy material that grows around the seed of a plant. It's not just something that we eat. It's any fleshy material around there. Like it says there, a few plants can reproduce asexually. This means that, like, for example, you could break a part of a plant, plant it, and it'll grow. Not all plants can do that, but some of them can. All right, and that's chapter 9. We discussed about a lot of really important stuff there. We talked about how plants reproduce. We talked about their structures. All right, I hope this was a good refresher for you guys as we talked about a lot of these important things, and I will see you later. Bye.